It's a good example of how Mr. Davis has spared no expense here at the ranch. Mark looked down to the other end of the table and saw that Jess and Lisa were talking with Todd's wife, Andrea. Mark thought they probably were gossiping about who had the nicest cabin. Light here. The men's talk drifted to the ranch's water supply. Todd explained that there were several wells already on the ranch when Mr. Davis bought it. They were for the cattle and were pumped by a water mill. The closest one to the camp had been fitted with a solar jack pump that used solar panels and a DC current pump. The brighter the sun shone, the more water it would pump. It filled a 3,000-gallon tank that gravity fed an identical tank in the complex. Each cabin was hooked into that tank. When both tanks were full, the overflow was piped to a freshwater pond on the ranch. Mark and Jim both thought it was an ingenious system. When dinner was over, the women who had been serving cleared the tables. Some of the children got board games and played quietly on one side of the room. Most of the younger children went outside to play, and a couple of the mothers went out to watch them. The rest of the adults and some of the teenagers gathered to listen to the president's speech. The president said that some power should be on any time now, but that it may take a little while to totally restore power. He assured the world that the U.S. would get the power back onto Wall Street as soon as possible, and that they should remain bullish on America. He ended by saying what a great loss the country had already endured and that everyone needed to concentrate their efforts on rebuilding America, not rioting and looting. After the speech, everyone talked about it, much like the talk at John's house every night. The big difference that Mark noticed was that everyone here pretty much agreed. They all believed the president was covering up the truth. Checklist. I need a checklist. Lights, camera, action, microphone, things like that. Sorry. Oh well. After the speech, everyone talked about it, much like the talk at John's house. They all believed the president was covering up the truth. The only difference of opinion here was the degree to which he was lying. After a while, some of the adults excused themselves to do some of the chores that needed to be finished before dark. Others started getting games out and playing. Many of the women were playing Scrabble. Jess and Lisa joined them. Some of the men were playing dominoes. Todd asked Jim and Mark if they knew how to play 42. When they said yes, he asked if they'd like to play him and Tom. When Mark and Jim had won 3 games in a row, Todd commented good-naturedly that he should have known better than to challenge 2 number crunchers. By that time, it was about 8:30 and dark. Everyone started drifting off to their cabins. Jim decided it was time to do the same and said goodnight to everyone. Mark and his family were right behind them. Before they left, Todd told them that breakfast was at 7 a.m. and they'd tour the rest of the ranch right after that. When they got back to their cabin, Mark asked everyone what they thought so far. David thought it would be great to live here. Sam said she hated it, which was no big surprise. Jess told Mark she thought it was a great setup, but that she was holding her opinion until she saw a little more. Mark was pleased that she was being so open-minded. Perhaps there was a chance she would see the logic of moving here. Everyone took their turn at the shower and then went to bed. Mark woke up a little after 6. It had been the best night's sleep he'd had since the burst. The cabin was pretty comfortable with the ceiling fan, and the fact that the complex had security didn't hurt either. He got out of bed and thought about running. Since he didn't know exactly what the security routine was, he decided to take the day off. Instead, he did some stretching and push-ups and sit-ups. After that, he got dressed and woke everyone up. A few minutes before 7, they headed over to the dining room. Todd was already there, talking with a few of the men about some things they needed to get accomplished. Todd invited both families to go on the tour. He said that he would drive the women in a Jeep and the guys could ride the ATVs. Jess, Lisa, and Sam asked if it would be okay for them to just hang around the complex. Todd told them that was fine, and the 3 men, with David in tow, headed to the garage. The ATVs were all new Polaris 4x4 quads. Todd asked David if he ever ridden one, and David told him that one of his friends had one and he rode it all the time. The men climbed on the 4 closest to the door and took off. When they left the complex, they headed toward the lake single file. At the lake, they stopped the ATVs and got off. Todd showed them the boats they had. There were two 16-foot John boats with 25 horsepower engines and a 17-foot canoe. They also had an 18-foot fiberglass boat with a center console and a 90-horse motor. All were tied to a floating dock with a walkway out to it from the bank, except the canoe was turned upside down on the dock. Nice boats, David said. Do you think these are what we need? Todd asked the men. The John boats are great for duck hunting and running trot lines. The skiff would be nice to fish out of. I don't know how much you'll use the canoe unless you run out of gas for the motors, Jim answered. Mark smiled. I don't know how comfortable I'd be in a canoe with the size of some of the gators I've seen in this lake. What's the biggest you've seen? Todd inquired. Maybe 12 foot long, but I didn't put a tape measure on them, if you know what I mean, Mark winked. The men climbed back onto the four-wheelers and rode around the perimeter of the ranch. They saw deer, turkey, and signs of feral hogs. The ranch was loaded with rabbits and had lots of dove and some quail. When they rode up to the pond that the solar jack pumped overflowed into, they scared 10 or 12 ducks off the surface. Well, it looks like there's lots of game, Mark observed. You just need to manage it a little, and it should supplement the food supply nicely. That's one of the things we want you guys for, Todd stated. What do you say we head back for some lunch? Then we can talk to Mr. Davis again. They made the short trip back to the complex just as lunch was being served. Todd excused himself to report to Mr. Davis. He told the men he'd come get them when the meal was over. Mark and Jim found their wives and headed over to eat. The couples sat together, and the men told the women about what they had seen on the tour. When they were done filling in the women, Jess and Lisa had some things to tell the guys. We visited with a lot of the women here while you were on the tour, Jess began. And they're not treated as equals here. They have little say in what goes on and how the work is split up. In fact, Mr. Davis makes the work assignments, and he makes it clear that it's his way or the highway. That's not all we noticed, Lisa continued. What percentage of the population of South Texas would you say Hispanics represent? At least half, Jim answered, as Mark nodded his head in agreement. Well, I don't know the exact number, but you're probably close. However, there's not one Hispanic or black family here. That's interesting, Jim said. None of that means anything necessarily, Mark stated. The women probably aren't used to having to work under crisis conditions, and maybe they just haven't found any Mexican families who fit what they need yet. Mark Turner, where there's smoke, there's probably fire. You need to look at this whole thing objectively. I am looking at it objectively, Mark whispered, rather than raise his voice and cause a scene. Maybe things aren't perfect here, but they don't look that bad to me. At least here we know we'll be fed and protected. That's something we don't have any assurance of at home. Well, I'm not real comfortable discussing this here. Why don't you go have your meeting with Mr. Davis, and then let's go home so we can make a decision with no outside pressure, Jess suggested.